In my presentation, I'd like to give you an overview of intergovernmental issues as we see across countries. Before the main presentation, I want to ask a provocative question. Why do we need local governments? Can't we have only central government providing services? The answer to that question is no, if you ask to economists. The founder of the modern public finance field, Richard Musgrave, defines three functions for government. The first one is macroeconomic management. The second one is income redistribution. Both of these functions lend themselves better for central government, whereas the efficient allocation of resources require establishing subnational or local governments. Based on Richard Musgrave's theory, there is a decentralization theory within the public finance field, which argues that there are two main arguments to have local governments. The first one is divergence in demand for local public goods and services. Not all population in all parts of a country have similar demand for local goods and services. Therefore, local governments being closer to people will be able to allocate resources more efficiently to provide those services. I don't want to go into too much technical details of the graph, but here these two blue triangles basically represents the efficiency gains from having local governments in a country. A second argument is the divergence in cost of provision of local services. Not all services cost the same amount in all local governments. Think about local governments in your countries. Some of the local governments are on top of a hill. Some of the local governments are by the water in a lowland area. Therefore, providing services would be different. The cost of providing services would be different from one local government to another local government. Those are the two main theoretical reasons why we need local governments. Then the question is, what kind of local governments we want to have in our countries? I guess the answer to that question is we want local governments with a lot of capacity to make decisions, which I call it discretion, but it's not only about that power. It's also local governments which are accountable to citizens in the use of public resources. So if we were to put this thing into a diagram like here, we want our local governments in the northwest quadrant where there's a high level of discretion as well as high level of accountability. How do we get there? How can we have more discretion and more accountability in our local government system? There are three dimensions of the puzzle. The first dimension is, I call it political, but it's about accountability systems. And the second dimension is administrative. You need local governments with administrative capacity to make decisions. And the third dimension is fiscal. You need to put together an effective intergovernmental fiscal system whereby local governments have responsibilities and resources. In each of these dimensions, we need to think about how we want to structure both discretion and accountability. In this field, think about political aspect of decentralization as only electoral accountability or elections. I think it's more than that. It's about the existence and quality of accountability systems for local leaders. And when we say local leaders, it's not only about mayors or heads of local governments. It's also about local councils who are going to be holding mayors to an account. who are going to be asking difficult questions to local mayors and maybe summoning local leadership into local council meetings, demanding accountability from them. There's also the judiciary aspect to accountability. There needs to be administrative courts at the local level so that citizens can take their cases to courts if there is injustice coming from their local governments. And you need robust civil society in order to keep local governments accountable for the resource use. If you want to go further into details, all of these things, you have to think about what kind of local accountability systems you want to have, what kind of financing systems you want to have for local leaders to come to power, what kind of participation systems you want to establish. In certain countries, certain types of local governments or local parties based on either ethnicity or religion is banned. Maybe that's what you want to have. Or you want to promote more participation, you want to promote more ethnicity or religion-based. But these are all context-specific. The most important point here is you need to have local governments which are accountable for the resources that they use. But accountability by itself is a function of discretion that they are going to have in the first place. Your local governments need to be making decisions related to economic activities in their jurisdictions. This is about making, changing, or enforcing either laws or regulations that have been enacted by local governments themselves. In many cases, this is about local economic development. This is about local land use planning, zoning planning, public safety. All of these things, local governments should be able to enact the legislation or legislative instruments, and they need to have power to sanction non-compliance. There's also the issue of procurement, procuring goods and services. When we say procurement, it's not only about procuring goods, but local governments need to have capacity to procure services. In many countries in this complex world, local services can be provided by private sector participation as well. In countries where local governments have capacity and legal authority to procure those services from private sector, they would be able to improve local infrastructure, for example. And of course, the last dimension of local administrative discretion is about managing the workforce at the local government level. Local governments need to be able to define their recruitment policies, and they should be able to pay their civil servants from their budget. The third dimension of decentralization is about designing an effective intergovernmental system, which is to say assigning service responsibilities according to assigning revenue sources for local governments, and then designing a transfer system to fill the gap between the two. And of course, a controversial issue is borrowing also. In many countries, there's a huge infrastructure gap at the local level, and public resources are not necessarily sufficient to fill that gap. But then you need to think about macro stability so that local governments can borrow for infrastructure services, for infrastructure provision, but be able to pay back those resources that they borrow from the markets. I don't want to go into too much details of these things. Again, the theory in the at least academic world gives guidance on how to think about all these four dimensions of an effective intergovernmental fiscal system. These are some of the examples that I put on my slide. Maybe if there's an interest during the Q&A session, I might be able to elaborate further on these issues. Similarly, on the revenue assignment, the idea is basically the revenues should be in correspondence to service delivery responsibilities. In many developing countries, and in some cases developed countries as well, local governments or subnational governments are heavily dependent on transfer resources, either by design or lack of will to mobilize their own resources. An effective intergovernmental fiscal system should be addressing this challenge. These are, again, examples from policy objectives of a transfer system. But commonly, we face this question of what's the best equalization system. There seems to be a great interest in equalization systems, but the word equalization itself can mean different things to different people. You can be equalized based on needs. You can be equalizing based on capacity. You can be equalizing based on effort principles, which is to say local governments which are raising revenues from their own sources would not be punished because they make the effort. There are other principles as well. Again, I don't want to go too much into detail, but what's important here is we need to think about designing an effective intergovernmental system whereby local services, local public goods are provided by local governments, and local governments are tapping into revenue sources assigned to them, and the transfer system addresses certain policy objectives of the government. To me, that's the definition of an effective intergovernmental fiscal system. Here, I gave you a brief visual of a trajectory of local government systems. In the development stage, in the earlier parts of the development stage, countries are usually very centralized. As they progress towards more developed status, there will be more and more effective and high-performing local government organizations. In the initial stage, there is a centralized provision of goods and services by the central government. Then there is usually an emphasis on establishing what's called the community-driven development projects or programs, giving some resources to communities to make their decisions and start to delegate certain responsibilities to the field offices of central government. From there on, the trajectory takes on, and the last stage is achieving a high-level decentralization with high-performing local government organizations. If we look at the situation in Southeast Asia, I'm quoting our colleagues. They published this piece into 2020, 3 years ago, looking at the South Asian, a sample of South Asian countries in terms of these three dimensions of decentralization or intergovernmental system. As you can see, there is a great variety, but I want to highlight certain facts here. So if you look at, for example, Vietnam is high level of decentralization if you look at the expenditures and assignment of responsibilities, and we will also see the functionaries, the civil service assigned to local government level. But then when we look at the revenue side of the issue, you'll see that that doesn't correspond to expenditure side. Resources are, or Vietnam is heavily dependent on transfer resources. Whereas when we look at Indonesia, you can see certain degree of decentralization of expenditure responsibilities corresponding to that there is certain level of revenues assigned to them. So, oops. Again, this is expenditure shares. As you can see, Vietnam has a high level of expenditures, which is 54, and I believe this amount has gone up since 2018. If I remember correctly, the latest figure is around 65–70% of public expenditures are at the local level, whereas Cambodia is highly centralized. Less than 10% of public expenditures are at the subnational level. China is an outlier. More than 90% of public expenditures are at the local level, whereas Indonesia, it's around similar to Indonesia. And when you look at this as OECD average, you can see that it's only 40%. So certain countries in Southeast Asia are way above OECD average. Other countries are way below OECD average. When we look at the own source revenues, though, that's where we have the issue. Look at Vietnam, for example. Vietnam, it's only around 10% of revenues are coming from own sources. 90% of revenues come as transfer from the central government level. Similarly, look at Cambodia. It has a low level of expenditure decentralization, but it has a low level of revenue decentralization as well. When you look at Indonesia, there is certain level of equilibrium both on the expenditure and revenue side. And you see a very diverse picture in terms of transfers as well. As you can see from here, certain countries use unconditional transfers and other countries use conditional transfer. For example, in Thailand, a main source of transfer vehicle to subnational governments are highly conditional, whereas in Cambodia or Indonesia, it's highly unconditional. Local governments have capacity or authority to decide how to spend those resources. This shows us a very mixed picture of local government transfer systems. Lastly, I want to talk to you about the share of civil service within overall public sector. As you can see here, in Cambodia, for example, local governments have very low share in terms of public expenditure or civil service employment. In that context, it's very difficult to assign more service delivery responsibilities. If you remember the initial parts of the presentation, we talked about administrative discretion together with fiscal discretion. The way I can put this thing to you is, imagine local governments who are highly capacitated and they have a lot of responsibilities, but they don't have the authority to hire civil servants. So how can you deliver these services? Or you can make the argument the other way around as well. You can give a lot of authority to local governments to assign service delivery responsibilities, but do not give them the resources for those service delivery responsibilities. So the main point here is we need to think about across these three dimensions: political, administrative, and fiscal, and there needs to be a level of equilibrium in assigning discretion and accountability to local governments to have an effective decentralization, to have an effective local government system for economic development purposes. With that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I'll wait for the Q&A session. If you want me to elaborate further on any of these points, happy to do so. Thank you.